The alarm went off at 5:12. Daniel Hayes didn't slam it. He reached across the nightstand in the dark and pressed the button with the flat of his thumb, the way a man does when he's been doing the same thing for long enough that even his reflexes have grown quiet about it. He lay there for 11 seconds. He counted, not because he was resting, the sleep hadn't been real sleep in months, but because he'd learned that if he stood up too fast, his lower back would seize, and he couldn't afford to walk crooked today. He had 2 shifts. The first started at 6:30, the second at 8 p.m. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building on North Pulaski that had seen better decades. The radiator ticked. The window above the kitchen sink had a hairline crack sealed with weather tape that he kept meaning to replace and kept not replacing. He pulled on a flannel shirt, tucked it in, and moved down the short hallway toward Emma's room without turning on the overhead light. He knew where every loose floorboard was. Her door was already cracked open 2 inches. She liked it that way, had, since she was 4, said she could hear the apartment breathing when it was quiet. He pushed it open softly. She was awake. She was always awake before he came in. She'd been that way since she was old enough to have a sense of time, some internal clock tuned to him, to his schedule, to the specific weight of his footsteps down the hall. "Morning," she said. Her voice was still half asleep, but her eyes were open, watching the ceiling. "Morning, Bug." She was 9. She had her mother's jawline and his eyes, which was the kind of thing that caught him off guard, sometimes not with grief exactly, more with something that sat below grief, quieter and more permanent. He didn't think about it when he had things to do. He had things to do most of the time. He sat on the edge of her bed and handed her socks from the dresser. She sat up, pulled them on herself. She'd been doing that since she was 6. She didn't ask him to tie her shoes anymore either. But this morning, one lace was looped wrong. He could see it from where he sat, and without saying anything, he knelt and redid it. She watched him with the patience of a child who has learned not to make a fuss about being taken care of. "You're doing the double today?" she asked. "Yeah. Is Mrs. Caldwell coming at 3? "At 3:15. She'll have dinner." Emma nodded. She picked up the small stuffed rabbit on her pillow and set it against the headboard, a ritual, a signal that she was properly awake and organizing her world. "Baked ziti again?" "Probably. I like her baked ziti." "I know you do." He went to the kitchen. The coffee maker was a $10 one from a second-hand shop on Milwaukee Avenue, and it hissed and sputtered in a way he'd made peace with. He poured Emma a glass of orange juice, put 2 pieces of bread in the toaster, and stood at the counter looking at the small notepad where he kept track of things. The checking account had $43 in it until Thursday. There was a copay due at Dr. Mercer's office, Emma's follow-up from the ear infection that he'd been sliding back by 2 weeks. The car needed a tire rotation it wasn't going to get. He folded the notepad shut and turned when he heard her socks on the kitchen floor. She climbed onto the stool at the counter. Her hair was in a ponytail she'd done herself, slightly off-center. He didn't fix it. "Dad," she said, "if you do 2 shifts, what time do you get home?" "Around 4:30. She chewed the toast he'd set in front of her. Looked at it. "That's really late." "It is." "Is it because of the money thing?" He looked at her. 9 years old, and she'd started asking questions like this, direct, unbothered, just trying to understand the structure of their life. He'd never decided whether to be proud of it or worried by it. He usually settled on both. "It's because of the money thing," he said, "but also because one of the guys called out and they needed someone." "Because of the money thing," she said again, not unkindly. "Yeah." She nodded and finished her toast. He drove her to school in the '09 Civic that had 214,000 miles on it. The heater worked, the radio didn't, which he'd stopped minding. She sat in the back because the passenger airbag light had been on since spring, and she was small enough that it still mattered. At the drop-off lane, she climbed out, swung her backpack on, and turned back to look at him through the open door. "Don't forget to eat something," she said. "You didn't eat breakfast. I'll get something from the vending machine." She gave him a look that was old for her face. Then she shut the door and walked toward the entrance without looking back. He watched until she was through the double doors. He sat in the idle car for another minute. The October sky was low and white, and a thin mist was already beginning. Not rain yet, just the city remembering that winter was coming. He pulled out of the lane and drove east toward Orion. There's a version of this story where Daniel Hayes never stopped being good at what he was good at. He spent 11 years at Helios Energy Systems, which in the mid-2010s was one of the 4 or 5 most sophisticated energy infrastructure companies operating in the Midwest. He'd come up through systems engineering the old way, not through a prestigious university pipeline. Though he had the degree, but through the kind of relentless hands-on learning that happens when you're the person who gets called at midnight because something's broken and no one else knows how. By 37, he was a senior systems engineer, managing the architectural integrity of a power load distribution network covering parts of Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana. He'd built, from scratch, a monitoring protocol for voltage cascade failures that reduced emergency response time from 11 minutes to under 4. The protocol was still running. He knew this because he'd checked once at 1 a.m. on a bad night, just to confirm that the work had survived even if the career hadn't. The problem started with a man named Gregory Alcott. Alcott was a VP of operations with 16 years at the company, a corner office, and a talent for making performance numbers look better than they were. Daniel had been running a quarterly audit routine, his responsibility when he found anomalies in the efficiency reporting from 3 substations in the northern grid. The kind of anomalies that, if you didn't know what you were looking at, blended seamlessly into the data. If you did know what you were looking at, they were unmistakable. Someone had been smoothing the variance figures by about 8% across the board, for regulatory reporting purposes. For 3 years, Daniel was leading that particular thread. He was terminated for cause. The blacklist in the energy systems sector is informal but absolute. It's not a list, technically. It's a series of phone calls, references who go quiet, hiring managers who suddenly lose interest at the background stage, doors that don't open. For 14 months, Daniel applied to positions he was categorically overqualified for and didn't hear back. He interviewed twice and was passed over. He ran out of savings, then equity, then options. His sister in Milwaukee helped with rent for 3 months, which was the most she could do and more than he'd wanted to ask. He took the job at Orion Grid Systems, not because he was desperate, though he was, and not because it was the only thing available, though in practical terms it was close. He took it because it was a night shift, which meant he could be home when Emma got back from school, and because the healthcare benefits kicked in after 60 days, and because, and this he didn't say out loud to anyone, there was something almost restful about working in a building full of systems he understood, even if no one knew he understood them. He became invisible. It turned out he was good at that, too. Orion Grid Systems occupied 11 floors of a glass tower on West Monroe Street in the Loop. The company managed smart grid infrastructure for a 6-state region, with its flagship product a load balancing and fault prediction platform called Atlas Grid, handling real-time distribution for just under 4 million residential and commercial endpoints. From the outside, it looked like every other fintech-adjacent company that had colonized downtown Chicago in the past decade. Glass lobbies, exposed concrete, standing desks, a coffee bar on the 5th floor that offered 3 kinds of oat milk. The culture ran fast and smart and slightly anxious, the way cultures do when the infrastructure they manage is simultaneously critical and perpetually under-resourced. The CEO was a woman named Sophia Bennett. She was 36, which made her young for the role. And she'd been in it for 4 years, which meant she'd long since stopped being new. She didn't do press much. She didn't do the conference circuit. She showed up in the office 6 days most weeks, knew the names of the facilities staff, read every post-incident report personally, and had a reputation not entirely unearned for being the most technically literate executive in a building full of people who'd gone to very good schools and learned to speak the language of systems without necessarily understanding the systems themselves. She'd built her career on a simple conviction: that critical infrastructure was not a software problem. It was an engineering problem that software could help with, and the difference mattered when things went wrong. She was not wrong about this. Daniel worked the building starting at 7 p.m. most nights. His route covered floors 3 through 8, the engineering floors, the server room corridors, the maintenance hallways behind the climate control infrastructure. He pushed his cart. He mopped. He replaced paper towel dispensers. He nodded to the engineers who stayed late, and they nodded back in the distracted way of people who are used to being served by an invisible class of labor. He didn't mind this. He had the precise interior life of a person who has learned to live in his own head without making it dramatic. He observed. He listened. He thought, and sometimes, when no one was watching, he'd stand in the corridor outside the server room and listen to the hum of the machines, the way a doctor listens to breathing with professional attention, calibrated to deviation, alert to anything that didn't quite belong. It was the second Friday in October, 10:47 p.m. The building had gone mostly quiet. There were 4 engineers still on the 8th floor. Daniel had seen them through the glass partition when he passed, bent over monitors with the focused exhaustion of people who'd been at it since morning. Whatever they were working on had a deadline. He could tell by the coffee cups and the absence of conversation. He was in the corridor outside the server room access point, running a damp mop along the baseboards. The corridor ran parallel to the climate control infrastructure, a ventilation channel about 18 inches wide that fed conditioned air into the server space. Standard setup, nothing unusual, except the sound. He stopped, stood still. Let the mop handle rest against the wall. The ambient hum of server infrastructure is layered a constant mid-frequency drone overlaid with the rhythmic cycling of cooling fans, punctuated at regular intervals by the click of relay switches and the softer pulse of load balancing as the system redistributes across nodes. It's not silence, but it has a structure, and inside that structure, if you know it well enough, anomalies are audible the way wrong notes are audible to someone who's played an instrument for 20 years. What Daniel heard was a micro-hesitation in the fan cycle. Not a failure, nothing like that. A stutter. A rhythm that was almost right, but not quite. Like a metronome that was losing a half beat every 43 seconds. He counted it twice to be sure. Then, he closed his eyes. He knew Atlas Grid. Not because he'd worked on it, he hadn't, but because he'd read the published architecture documentation when he'd taken the job. In the same, compulsive, automatic way that a former surgeon might study a hospital's surgical protocols on their first week as an orderly. He'd read it 3 times, actually, in the break room during his first week, eating a sandwich, because the alternative was to stop thinking about systems entirely, and he wasn't ready to do that. The fan cycle in a server environment is tied to the cooling protocol, which in Atlas Grid's architecture was a dual redundancy system, a primary cooling loop and a secondary that came online when primary load exceeded 70%. What he was hearing, this specific stutter at this specific interval, was consistent with a condition he'd encountered once before, at Helios, in a different system but with the same underlying logic. A protocol conflict. 2 processes sharing a resource lock, each checking the status of the other at intervals that occasionally overlapped. When the overlap happened, both processes paused for the duration of a handshake that was never completed. In low-stakes environments, this produced a barely perceptible delay. In a system managing load distribution for millions of endpoints, during a high-demand test cycle, it could produce a cascading failure. He stood in the corridor for 3 minutes, running the logic through his head. He pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app and wrote 12 lines of text, not code, just reasoning. Structured the way engineers structure thinking before they write code. He read it back. Changed 1 word. Read it again. Then he looked at the server room door. The access panel required a keycard. His keycard facilities level did not authorize server room entry. There was an emergency override protocol for facilities staff in the event of fire, active leak, or structural emergency. The override required him to document the reason in a digital log that was reviewed by building management. He stood there for a while. He thought about Emma. About the $43. About the copay at Dr. Mercer's office. Then he thought about what would happen on the 22nd. He'd seen the internal calendar posting. Facilities staff weren't supposed to read it, but the posting had been visible on a monitor he'd been cleaning around when Atlas Grid ran its quarterly stress test. Full load simulation. Every endpoint active simultaneously. If the cooling protocol conflict triggered a deadlock under that load, the system wouldn't just stutter, it would cascade. The scope of a cascade failure in a 6-state load management system was not a small thing. He typed his override reason. Anomalous HVAC pattern detected. Potential cooling system issue. He pressed his card to the panel. The door opened. The server room was cold and loud and clean. Rows of rack units stretched the length of the space. Indicator lights cycling green and amber in a slow rhythm that was visible even under the fluorescent overheads. The temperature was 58 degrees. His breath didn't mist barely, but he felt the cold settle into his collar. He walked the rows methodically. He wasn't looking for something physical. What he was doing was confirming a hypothesis through observation, checking the indicator patterns against what he expected to see if the cooling protocol conflict was real. He found it at rack 14. 2 amber indicators cycling at an interval that was almost regular but not quite. Not alarming to the eye, the system was designed to flag only red. Not amber chains, but to someone who knew what the amber sequence meant in context. It was readable. He sat down on the floor in front of the rack. There was no chair. He pulled out his phone and opened a note and began writing. And this time, what he wrote was actual logic, not code exactly, more like pseudocode, the skeleton of a fix that would need to be properly implemented in the actual system, but that he could map out completely from memory and reasoning. The issue was in the handshake timing between the primary and secondary cooling loops. The primary loop checked secondary status every 8 seconds. The secondary loop, under load, began polling primary status at an interval that drifted not randomly, but deterministically, based on load percentage. At 71% load, the secondary poll interval fell to approximately 8 seconds as well. When both processes polled simultaneously, neither received a response within its timeout window. Both reset. Both restarted their cycle. Under moderate load, this reset cycle completed in under a second with no meaningful impact. Under full stress test load, the reset cycle time extended. The overlap frequency increased, and the deadlock window expanded until the system couldn't recover within the automatic restart threshold. The fix was not complicated. It was elegant. In the way that the right answer to a real problem is always elegant once you see it. Reduce the primary loop's check interval to 2 seconds, which eliminated the overlap possibility because the secondary's polling drift could never synchronize with a 2-second cycle under any load condition. No deadlock window, no cascade risk. He wrote it out in 9 lines. He looked at the access log on the rack panel's small display. He was in a read-only monitoring interface. He hadn't touched anything. But there was a maintenance input terminal 3 racks down, accessible to anyone with physical access, used for diagnostic commands. He walked to it. He knew that what he was about to do was either a fireable offense or the most useful thing he'd done in 14 months. He knew he couldn't tell anyone about it. He knew he'd probably have to leave it unsigned, unacknowledged, unremarkable. He typed the commands. 12 keystrokes. He tested the logic 3 times before he executed, running the sequence mentally each time to confirm there were no downstream effects he'd missed. He executed. He waited. For 40 seconds, nothing changed. Then, the 2 amber indicators on rack 14 went green. The fan cycle smoothed. He could hear it, the stutter resolved, the rhythm became regular. The hum of the room shifted by some small but perceptible degree, the way a room shifts when something that was wrong becomes right. He stood there in the cold and the noise, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride. Pride was too loud for what it was. It was more like recognition, like the particular relief of being what you actually are, even briefly, even alone, even when it changes nothing. He picked up his phone. He deleted the notes. He walked back to the door. He logged out on the maintenance terminal. He let the door close behind him. He picked up his mop. He finished his shift. He drove home in the mist. He ate a granola bar in the parking lot of the building because Emma had told him to eat something, and it was the only thing he had. He went home at 4:22 a.m. and checked on Emma, who was asleep, and he stood in the door of her room for a moment without going in. Then he went to bed. He didn't tell anyone. Sophia Bennett had a habit she'd developed during the first year of the CEO role that she'd never managed to break. She reviewed security footage. Not all of it. Not obsessively. But when something caught her eye in the incident logs, when a flag that should have been minor turned out to be adjacent to something larger, she pulled the footage. The Atlas Grid team had been struggling for 11 days with what their lead architect, a careful and experienced man named Trevor Walsh, had described as a performance anomaly in the cooling protocol under high-load simulation. They'd reviewed the architecture documentation. They'd run diagnostics. They'd brought in 2 external consultants who had both confirmed the anomaly was real, and neither of them had identified the source. On Tuesday morning at 2:04 a.m., Sophia was in her home office reviewing the incident log from the previous Friday, which she'd been flagging to get to all weekend, when she noticed that the anomaly indicators on rack 14, the ones that had been amber for 3 days, had resolved. Spontaneously, according to the log. No maintenance ticket. No engineer sign-off. There was a facilities override entry in the access log from 11:09 p.m. Friday. Cooling system concern. 37 minutes of access. She pulled the footage. The man in the server room had the build of someone who'd been doing physical work for a long time, but carried it without heaviness. The posture of someone who'd spent years at a desk before that. He walked the rack rows with a systematic attention that was not the attention of a facilities employee checking for leaks. He sat on the floor. He wrote on his phone for a long time. He walked to the maintenance terminal with the particular, purposeful stride of someone who knows exactly where they're going and what they're going to do when they get there. She watched him type. She watched the indicators turn green. She pulled the maintenance terminal log and found 12 keystrokes and the timestamp. 11:38 p.m. She pulled the system performance log for the same interval and traced the fan cycle correction forward to the present no recurrence of the anomaly. No drift. No amber indicators on rack 14 or anywhere adjacent. She sat back in her chair. At 2:31 a.m., she pulled up the facilities roster and found the override entry. D. Hayes, Facilities Level 2, Employee ID 7741. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she called her assistant's cell phone. Marcus was used to late calls. He picked up on the second ring. "I need a full background on an employee," she said. Facilities. Name is Daniel Hayes, ID 7741. I need everything prior employment, certifications, any professional records. By 7. Tonight's 7 or tomorrow's 7? Tomorrow morning's 7. Okay. She paused. Marcus? Yeah? Be thorough. She hung up. She looked at the frozen frame on her monitor, Daniel Hayes walking away from the maintenance terminal, picking up his mop from where it leaned against the wall, moving back toward the door. Unhurried, unremarkable. She watched it twice more. Then she went to make coffee, because she wasn't going back to sleep. The report landed in her inbox at 6:47 a.m. Marcus had been thorough. Marcus was always thorough. It was the quality she valued most in an assistant. That consistent, unsentimental attention to completeness. He'd been with her through 2 jobs before this one, and she'd never once had to ask him to go deeper on something he'd already looked at. Daniel Richard Hayes, 44, formerly Senior Systems Engineer at Helios Energy Systems, Chicago. 11-year tenure. Promoted 3 times. Performance reviews consistently in the top tier of his cohort. There were notes in the HR file from 2 different supervisors, one from his 3rd year, one from his eighth that used almost identical language. Technical judgment exceptional. Operates significantly above grade level. Identifies systemic issues before they become operational problems. Primary architect of the Cascade Failure Early Warning Protocol that had been adopted as standard practice across Helios's northern grid operations in 2019. She pulled the public documentation on that protocol. It was elegant. She wasn't an engineer. By training, she'd come up through operational management, but she'd spent enough time in rooms full of systems engineers to read the difference between competent work and exceptional work, and this was the latter. The protocol had reduced emergency response windows by 63% in its first year of operation and had not been significantly revised since. Terminated for cause, January of the previous year. Reason cited, unauthorized access to protected executive files. Case documentation on file with the Illinois Department of Labor, reviewed during an employment dispute that Hayes had pursued through legal channels and then withdrawn. She noted the date of withdrawal, cross-referenced it with a separate document Marcus had included, understood immediately. He had withdrawn the dispute 3 months after termination. At that point, based on the subsequent medical billing records that Marcus had found through a court filing tied to an insurance dispute, not prying. Exactly. It was all technically public. He would have been managing Emma's hospitalization. A 5-day inpatient stay, acute ear infection with complications. He'd been fighting an employment case with no income and a sick child and a medical bill large enough to appear in a lawsuit. And at some point the math had become impossible. She read that section twice. She set the report down for a moment. She picked it up again. The next section Marcus had flagged with a red asterisk and a brief note in his careful handwriting. He still handwrote his notes on printed reports, a habit she'd never asked him to change. Relevant context, see Federal Court Records, Case No. As attached. Gregory Alcott, former VP of Operations at Helios Energy Systems, had been under federal investigation for securities fraud and regulatory data manipulation since 8 months ago. The specifics of the case were detailed in the public filing. Systematic misrepresentation of substation efficiency data across a 3-year period for the purpose of meeting regulatory performance benchmarks and securing a preferential rate classification that had saved the company approximately $40 million in grid compliance fees. The investigation had been triggered by a compliance tip, anonymous, formally speaking, but traceable in the public record if you knew what threads to pull, and Marcus had known to the period immediately following Hayes's termination. The original internal report, redacted, had been referenced in the federal filing as the basis for the initial inquiry. She sat with this for a longer while than she usually allowed herself to sit with anything. The technical assessment was at the bottom of the report. Marcus had asked Trevor Walsh without specifying why, just as a favor, a quick technical review of an incident log to look at the maintenance terminal commands from Friday night. Walsh's response, included in full, was brief and characteristically direct. Whoever wrote this had a complete and working understanding of the dual redundancy handshake architecture, which is not in any publicly available specification. The fix is correct. It's the fix I would have written if I had found the root cause, which I had not. This came from someone with direct, hands-on experience in protocol-level systems engineering at a sophisticated level. The command sequence shows zero hesitation and no trial and error iterations. They knew exactly what they were doing before they sat down at the terminal. Who wrote this? Sophia closed her laptop. She went to the window. She was in early. It was just past 7. The floor was mostly empty. Someone on the far side of the open plan was making coffee that she could smell from here but not see. The city below was gray and misted, the lake invisible this morning. Everything smudged at its edges the way Chicago got in October when the weather came off the water. She stood at the window and thought about a man who had, on a Friday night in October, heard something wrong in a corridor, understood it, fixed it, and gone back to mopping floors, who had not filed a report, not flagged the incident, not said a word to anyone, who had come back to work the following Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and done his job as though nothing had happened. She thought about why a person would do that. She thought about the employment dispute withdrawn under financial duress, about the credentials that had been effectively destroyed, about the 11 years of exceptional work sitting in Helios's operational systems, humming away reliably, credited to no one. She thought she understood. She went to make coffee. She stood at the coffee machine on her office's small credenza and watched it brew and thought, I would have done the same thing. If every channel I'd tried had closed on me, if I'd been burned by going through proper processes, if the cost of being wrong about whether to speak up was my daughter's stability, I'd have fixed it quietly and kept my head down too. That was the part she understood completely. The part that troubled her, in a way she found professionally useful, was that her company had created the conditions under which the most capable person in the building was mopping its floors in silence. That wasn't about Daniel Hayes. That was about a system that hadn't looked at him and seen what he was. She took her coffee back to her desk. She opened the report again. She started drafting a note to her legal team. She had a lot to untangle before Thursday. Daniel had 4 days of not knowing. He went about his shifts. He didn't check the server room. That would have been obvious. He knew that, even if no one was watching, which he was not certain was the case. He changed light bulbs and restocked supply closets and mopped the corridor outside the server room at his regular time without looking at the access panel. On Monday, he thought about it on the drive to drop Emma at school and decided it was probably fine. Nobody was going to notice 12 keystrokes that resolved a problem no one had officially documented yet. On Tuesday, he thought about it less. On Wednesday, almost not at all. On Thursday morning at 7:52 a.m., he was due to start at 8. He was sitting in the break room, eating one of the granola bars Emma had put in his jacket pocket that morning, without saying anything about it. His supervisor knocked on the break room door frame. Hayes. He looked up. They want you on 8. He had no expression for this. Now, he rode the elevator to the 8th floor in his work uniform with his ID badge on his chest. He'd worked in this building for 8 months and had never been above the 6th floor on purpose. The 8th was different, quieter, higher ceilings, a different quality of light, the specific atmosphere of a floor where decisions were made. A woman he didn't recognize met him at the elevator. Young, efficient, holding a tablet. Mr. Hayes, Miss Bennett will see you in the conference room. Follow me. He didn't ask what this was about. He knew what it was about. The conference room had a long table and a wall of windows looking west over the city. Sophia Bennett was already seated at the head of the table. She was in a charcoal blazer, no jewelry, a coffee cup in front of her. 2 other people were in the room, a man Daniel recognized from the engineering floor and a woman he didn't know who had the look of legal. He sat where they indicated. He put his hands on the table. Sophia Bennett looked at him for a moment without speaking. Mr. Hayes, she said, I'm going to show you something. I'd like you to watch it and then tell me what you see. She turned a laptop toward him. The footage was from inside the server room. He watched himself walk the rows. He watched himself sit on the floor. He watched the indicators turn green. He watched himself walk out. When it ended, she closed the laptop. What were you doing in that room? She said. He could have said many things. He chose the simplest version. I heard something. She waited. In the corridor, fan cycle. It had an irregular pattern, a stutter at about a 43-second interval. I recognized it as potentially consistent with a protocol handshake conflict. How did you recognize it? I've worked with similar systems. Where? He looked at her steadily. Helios Energy Systems. Senior Systems Engineer. I designed the early warning protocol they still use on the northern grid. The man from engineering, she saw him glance at her, said nothing. And the fix? She said. Adjusted the primary loop check interval from 8 seconds to 2. It eliminates the overlap condition that creates the deadlock window. Under any load percentage, the secondary drift can't synchronize with a 2-second cycle. She let that sit in the room for a moment. My lead architect, she said, spent 11 days looking for that. I know, he said. I could hear what the problem was. That made it easier. It wasn't arrogance. It was just true, and they both knew it. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Tell me what happened at Helios," he told her. Not everything, not all of it, but enough. The compliance report, the credential cloning, the termination, the 14 months. He described it with the particular flatness of someone who has recounted a bad year enough times that the emotion has been worn off it, the way river stones go smooth. He was not performing composure. He was simply past the part where the telling of it cost him anything. It was history now. History that had consequences, but history. He described Gregory Alcott without naming him as the source of the data manipulation, he said, a VP of operations, because old habits of precision died slowly, and he hadn't been asked to name names, and he wasn't interested in performing the kind of righteous anger that would have made the story more satisfying to listen to but less true. He described the credential cloning incident, the physical security flag 18 months before his termination, the reported cloning, the quiet resolution that he now understood was a quiet burial, with the tone of someone giving a technical briefing, because that was the frame that made it manageable to talk about. He described the withdrawal of the employment dispute the way he described the rest of it. Plainly, he'd run out of bandwidth. Emma had been in the hospital. The math didn't work. He'd let it go. When he said Emma's name, something shifted in the room. He felt it without being able to describe exactly what had shifted. The woman from legal wrote something on her notepad. Trevor Walsh, who hadn't spoken since the meeting began, looked at his hands. When he finished, Sophia Bennett was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone deciding what to say, the quiet of someone who had already decided and was making sure the decision was fully formed before she said it. She opened a folder on the table and slid a printed document toward him. It was the federal court filing. The investigation into Alcott, she'd used his name in the document. So there it was, printed and formal, with the case number and the charge summary and the timeline. Gregory Alcott, VP of Operations, Helios Energy Systems, Securities Fraud, Regulatory Data Manipulation, Systematic Misrepresentation over 3 years, Public Record. Her assistant's summary clipped to the front. Daniel looked at it. He'd seen a mention of it somewhere, a news alert, months ago, that he'd clicked on and then put away because looking at it had felt like pressing on a bruise. Seeing it printed and formal was different. It made it real in a different way, not emotionally different, but structurally different. It gave the thing that had happened to him a frame, a context, a place in a larger pattern that had now been documented and filed and was being formally adjudicated. He had been right. He had known he was right. But there's a difference between knowing you're right and having it written down by a federal court. He sat with it for a moment. The timeline in the filing, Sophia said. The initial compliance tip that triggered the inquiry, it corresponds to the period immediately after your termination. I know, he said. Your report was what started this. I know. He looked at the document. He thought about the 14 months. About the second-hand coffee maker and the weather tape on the kitchen window and the $43. He thought about Emma asking, in the patient voice of a child who has calibrated herself to difficult realities, whether he was doing the double shift again. He thought about the granola bars she put in his jacket pockets without saying anything about it. He handed the document back. It doesn't undo what it cost, he said. No, she said. It doesn't. She held his gaze. Mr. Hayes, she said, I want to offer you a position. He said nothing. He kept his hands flat on the table. Senior Systems Architect. Reporting to me directly, with a specific focus on infrastructure integrity across the Atlas Grid platform. You'd have full system access, a dedicated review mandate, and a direct line to the engineering leadership. She named a salary. It was more than he'd made at Helios in his best year. Considerably more. We'll also provide full legal and HR support for clearing your professional record, she continued. Your certifications, your employment history, the termination for cause notation. We have counsel who handles professional reputation remediation. It won't happen overnight, but we'll resource it properly and we'll see it through." She paused. "That matters to me as much as the technical offer. What happened to your record was wrong. We can help correct it." She said this without softening her voice into sympathy, which he appreciated. She was stating it as a position, not offering condolences. "The offer," she said, "is contingent on your accepting that what you did last Friday was simultaneously a serious breach of access protocol. You used an emergency override for a non-emergency situation by the formal definition and the reason that 11 million people in this region are not going to experience a grid failure on the 22nd. I'm holding both of those things to be true at the same time. Does that make sense?" "Yes," he said. "Good." A brief pause. "Do you have questions?" He thought about this for a moment. He had many questions. He chose the one that was most practical. "I'd need a week," he said. "Before I start." She raised an eyebrow. "My daughter," he said. "Her schedule. Mrs. Caldwell has a gap on Tuesday afternoons, and I'd need to find coverage for the morning drop-off if my hours are different, and I'd want to talk to her teacher about." He stopped. He was aware that he was explaining logistics to a CEO in a conference room on the 8th floor of a glass tower in the Loop. "I'd need a week to arrange things." Sophia Bennett looked at him for a moment. Something in her expression changed in a way that was subtle and not entirely professional. Not warmth exactly, more like recognition. The particular expression of someone encountering a fact that is small but clarifying. "Take two," she said. He drove home through the Loop in the late afternoon. The mist had thickened into a proper drizzle, the kind that catches in the orange streetlights and makes the city look like a watercolor version of itself. The Civic's wipers worked on the driver's side. The passenger side one had a streak it had been leaving since August. He didn't call anyone. There was no one to call. Not immediately his sister in Milwaukee. Maybe, later tonight, but not now. He wasn't ready to explain it yet, and he wasn't sure he could do it without his voice doing something he wasn't prepared for. He sat in the car for a few minutes after he parked in front of the building on North Pulaski, with the engine off, listening to the rain on the roof. There was no appropriate word for what had happened. He'd thought about language on the drive home and had come up mostly empty. It wasn't relief. Relief was what you felt when a bad thing didn't happen. This was something else, something with more weight than that. The feeling of a structure that had been under load for a long time and was now, incrementally, releasing. He went upstairs. Mrs. Caldwell had left an hour ago, but the apartment was warm. She'd turned up the radiator, and there were dishes drying on the rack. Emma was at the kitchen table doing homework, pencil in hand, textbook open, the particular concentration of a child who was trying very hard to make sense of long division. She looked up when he came in. "You're home early," she said. "Yeah." She studied him the way she sometimes did, that quiet, calibrated attention. "You look different. I had a meeting." "A good meeting?" He sat down at the table across from her. He put his keys on the table. He looked at his daughter, who had her mother's jawline and his eyes and a stuffed rabbit on her pillow and a pencil she was gripping too tight because long division was harder than it looked. "I got a real job," he said. She looked at him. Not excitedly, she processed things at her own pace. Always had. "Like a different job? Not the cleaning?" "Not the cleaning." "What kind of job?" "The kind I used to do," he said. "Before." She sat with this for a moment. Then she put her pencil down, carefully, and got up from her chair and came around the table and hugged him, not dramatically, not with a lot of noise, just her arms around his neck and her chin on his shoulder. She was small enough that he could feel the whole of her against him. He sat very still. "Okay," she said into his shoulder. "Okay," he said. She went back to her seat and picked up her pencil. "Is it more money?" "It is." "Can we fix the car radio?" He looked at her. "Yeah. We can fix the car radio." She nodded and went back to long division. He sat at the table for a while, not doing anything, just being in the warm apartment with his daughter doing her homework. The rain coming down outside the cracked window with the weather tape, the radiator ticking. The first Monday. He drove Emma to school in the Civic, the radio still broken. He'd get to it, probably next week. She had her backpack and her ponytail, slightly off-center. He didn't fix it. At the drop-off, she climbed out, swung the bag on, and turned back. "Don't forget to eat breakfast," she said. "I have a thing in the break room now, coffee and everything." She considered this as sufficient. "Okay. Then, good luck." "It's not my first day," he said. "I've been there 8 months. It's your first day of the new thing," she said, and shut the door. He watched her walk through the double doors. He drove east. The building on West Monroe looked the same from the outside. Glass tower, lobby with exposed concrete, the coffee bar on the 5th floor. He took the elevator to the 8th, his floor now, or close to it. He'd been given an office 2 doors down from the engineering leads, a desk and a monitor and a key card with a different set of access permissions. Trevor Walsh was in the corridor when he got off the elevator. Walsh was a methodical man in his late 50s, with an engineer's habit of saying exactly what he meant and nothing else. He'd been the one who'd reviewed the maintenance terminal commands, whose question, "Who wrote this?" was sitting in Sophia Bennett's inbox at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. He stopped when he saw Daniel. "Hayes," he said. "Walsh." Walsh looked at him for a moment. "The 2-second interval fix," he said. That was elegant. It was the obvious solution once you could hear what the problem was. Walsh nodded slowly. "I couldn't hear it." "You were looking at the logs," Daniel said. "The logs didn't show it cleanly. You needed the physical space." "Yes," Walsh said. "That's right." He paused. "I'd like to walk through the full architecture with you this week, if you're open to it. I want to know what else you can hear that we can't." "I'm open to it," Daniel said. Walsh nodded again and went back to his office. Daniel walked to his desk and sat down. The monitor was on. The keycard on the lanyard around his neck had his name on it. D. Hayes. Systems architecture. Not facilities level. Not limited access. He set his coffee down. He opened the Atlas Grid documentation, the full version. Not the public architecture doc, but the complete internal specification, and began to read. He wasn't reading it for the first time. He'd read most of it already, in the break room on his phone, in the parking lot, in the quiet minutes between tasks on night shifts in the corridors. He wouldn't be mopping anymore. He knew most of it already, had internalized its architecture the way you internalize a language you've spoken long enough that you stop translating. But reading it now was different. Reading it now, he could annotate it, could flag the sections that needed review, could write margin notes in the document itself that someone would read and act on. He could be useful in a way that was visible. He read for 20 minutes. Then he opened a new document and started writing. Outside, the October mist had lifted. The lake was visible from the corner of the window. If you leaned right, he could see the gray-blue of it between buildings, flat and wide, the horizon somewhere out there beyond it. He didn't lean right. He kept reading. He had a lot of work to do.